Welcome to the most important and the most influential Japanese giant monster movie of all time. I know that's a bold statement, but I plan to back it up. My name is David Kalat. I'm a film historian. Among my publications is the book A Critical History and Filmography of Toho's Godzilla series by McFarland Press. I'll be your audio commentarian for the next 100 minutes. As an introductory statement, I'd like to tell you 3 quick anecdotes that I think help situate Mothra as an extraordinarily influential and pioneering work. So let me tell you these 3 short stories, and then we'll dig into the history and making of the movie more properly. 1. Back in the early 2000s, when I was living in Washington, D.C., and my children were young, I learned of a theatrical screening of Mothra, and obviously this was must-see entertainment, as both of my children were natural-born fans of Japanese monsters. When we got to the theater, though, we discovered that what was on offer was this, the original cut in Japanese with English subtitles. Neither of my kids was an especially strong reader at the time, and I'd never tried to show them a subtitled movie before. But we stuck it out, and somehow, they ended up enjoying it anyway. The movie was so aesthetically pleasing on its own that it worked as entertainment even for audience members unable to follow what was being said, which frankly is how most opera fans react to opera. 2. In Japan, like everywhere else, the advent of television took an enormous bite out of theatrical box offices. People stopped going to the movies when they could be entertained at home for free. In an effort to lure audiences back, especially child audiences, Toho instituted the Toho Champion Festival. And between 1969 and 1978, they put together packages of classic monster movies, Disney cartoons, and re-edited episodes of superhero shows like Ultraman, which was wickedly clever, you have to admit, to compete with television by compelling kids to come to the theater to pay to watch TV shows. The Champion Festival provided an outlet for cut-down versions of many of the Godzilla movies, and because the emphasis on the most family-friendly ones, the original 1954 Godzilla was not part of the Champion Festival. In fact, the earliest, oldest giant monster film that Toho included in the festival was Mothra. And as we'll talk about in detail, the 1954 Godzilla was unlike the bulk of Toho's monster movies in several key respects, but Mothra is the origin point of the modern concept of Japanese monsters, which is what we'll be exploring in the conversation to come. 3. Nowadays, the concept of a shared cinematic universe is fairly commonplace, enough to even warrant an abbreviation, CU, for people who spend so much time talking about cinematic universes they need to save time saying those words out loud. Of course, the most well-known example of that phenomenon is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in which characters and storylines introduced in seemingly standalone films intersect with one another. The concept of crossing over characters from different movies into a combined franchise dates back farther than you might guess. In the 1940s, Universal Pictures kept their increasingly moribund Frankenstein cycle going by allowing other monsters to cross over, to bring all the Universal monsters into one shared continuum. And even earlier than that, in 1933, Testament of Dr. Mabuse brought characters together from the previously unrelated films M and Dr. Mabuse the Gambler. But neither of these instances had the enduring pop-cultural cachet that bringing Mothra into Godzilla did. So to the extent contemporary filmmakers look back into film history for a guide to a shared cinematic universe, Mothra is an obvious and compelling touchstone. No, your eyes are not deceiving you. That is Kenji Sahara, one of Toho's up-and-coming movie stars and the lead player in Rodan, the Mysterians, and the romantic lead in The H-Man. And here he is as a helicopter pilot, and this brief scene is the sum total of his contribution to Mothra. It's a walk-on cameo for a genuine movie star. So the best place to start is at the beginning. Where did this movie come from? The genesis came in 1960, when Toho president Iwao Mori had come to recognize that women were an important audience segment, and the company's future depended on reaching that audience better. This was driven in part by some demographic research that showed that women tended to bring others with them when they went to the movies, dates or family members or friends. The point was, marketing to women was a multiplier effect. Mori decided that the studio should make a giant monster film that would especially appeal to women. And to that end, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka went to a novelist named Shinichiro Nakamura and invited him to develop a story idea. Nakamura then turned to his colleagues Takahiko Fukunaga and Zene Hota with the idea that the three of them would divvy up the task and each write a third of the overall story. Anyway, these three men, Nakamura, Fukunaga, and Hota, set out to do the work of one and write a story about a giant monster moth. And they stitched together the pieces written individually by the three of them into a single work, which was published under the title The Luminous Fairies and Mothra. And I'm going to refer to that as a novelization, even though it was written first, and it doesn't really track the finished film all that closely, but nonetheless, this novelization, if you will, establishes some of the key pieces. The little fairy priestesses, the idea that Mothra is a monster god, the way that Infant Island survived radiation exposure, and so on. The novelization was then published in the Weekly Asahi Extra in January 1961 as a way of drumming up interest in the upcoming movie, which opened in Japan later that year on July 30th. And just to be clear, to my knowledge, no English translation of this novel has ever been made. I am relying on John LeMay's description of it from his book, Writing Japanese Monsters, for everything that I say about the content of the book version. In the novelization, there was a character named Shinichiro Zen Fukuda, a combination of the names of the authors Shinichiro Nakamura, Takahiko Fukunaga, and Zene Hota. By the time he appears on screen, the character has been given the Japanese nickname Snapping Turtle, or Bulldog in the English language version, to signal his tenacious attitude. Funny thing is, though, tenacity isn't really the characteristic we most readily associate with him. Instead, the character is predominantly a comedy figure. Now, it is at this point that some commentators grumble that this trio of novelists were better acquainted with Western literature than they were with science fiction and didn't necessarily have the right orientation to develop a sci-fi story. But really the question to ask is, if the assignment from Toho's topmost brass was to make a monster movie for women, why it never occurred to anyone to seek out a female writer? But did they? The great but late great Guy Mariner Tucker said that Zene Hota was a woman, the first woman writer associated with the giant monster genre. And that may be because Hota usually worked under the name Yoshi Hota, and Yoshi is recognizably a female Japanese name. But Yoshi Hota was born Yoshimamoru Hota. There are photos of him online. He was an essayist, a novelist, and a biographer. He's best known for the book Judgment, a sprawling historical novel about World War II. So despite the misleading name, Hota was a guy. So why no ladies? Sure, it was a male-dominated field, but there were female writers like Shugeko Hashida, arguably Japan's most successful TV screenwriter. She'd been working at Shochiku until 1960, and then was freelancing when Tanaka went looking for someone to write Mothra. Just saying is all. Mothra was Toho's most expensive production to date. Costlier by far than Godzilla, and awarded at least as luxurious a pre-production schedule as had been given the previous pull-out-all-the-stops blockbuster Battle in Outer Space. Its production budget was 200 million yen. Now, to put that in context, that production budget is in the neighborhood of twice what Battle in Outer Space grossed in box office receipts. Part of what made this profligacy possible was the partnership with Columbia Pictures, who agreed to distribute the film in America. Now, in various English-language sources on the history and making of Mothra, there's been something of a disagreement, or debate, on exactly what the contours of Columbia's involvement entailed. Did they put up production financing, or did they just sign a distribution deal? Well, the thing is, those are really the same thing. You see, most corporate movie production is financed by debt. It's why there's such an emphasis on formulas and franchises, on movie stars and trends, because it is that litany of recognizable marketing hooks that persuades a bank to underwrite a loan. So consider the following scenarios. In scenario 1, Toho goes to the bank and says, "We're making a full-color monster movie. It's going to be bigger than Godzilla. Here's all the things about it we think are going to be exciting and popular, blah, 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 blah." Now, in scenario 2, Toho goes to the bank with that exact same story, but they lead with, hey, and one of the biggest movie studios in Hollywood has already agreed to show this movie across America and will give it a full court press of publicity. If you were a banker, which offer would you think is a safer bet? Columbia did put some strings on their offer, and will address those conditions when the relevant moments come up on screen. As a sign of the film's ambitions towards being an all-ages, family-friendly blockbuster, we've got Frankie Sakai in the lead. Most of the comedy in the film comes from his slapstick antics. Funny, without being a laughingstock, Sakai allows the film to maintain a light touch, without ruining the tension necessary for a monster movie. Sakai had launched his career at Nikkatsu in 1953, and he developed such a reputation for slapstick that his name was in effect a brand name for comedy. Toho poached him from Nikkatsu and starred him in a franchise series called Station Front. Sakai starred in all 24 Station Front films, which ran until 1969. But as ubiquitous as Sakai's comedy work was in Japan, as far as Western audiences go, he's more likely to be recognized for his role as Lord Yabu in NBC's 1980 miniseries Shogun. In order to best illustrate what it was about Mothra that was so revolutionary, so influential, it helps to contrast it with how that differed from the model exemplified by Godzilla. So when I talk about the Mothra Model, I mean movies that followed in Mothra's footsteps as family-friendly, goofy, fun, fantasy-oriented spectacles, which is going to be the overwhelming majority of Toho's special effects-based output in the 1960s and 1970s. And when I talk about the Godzilla model, what I'm talking about are the 1954 Godzilla and the films that followed its pattern. Godzilla Raids Again, The Return of Godzilla in 1984, the 1998 TriStar Godzilla, Shin Godzilla, as well as things like Rodan and Varan the Unbelievable. Now, you may not yet see how I'm cataloging these to put some of these movies together and not others, but hopefully it'll come into focus in just a moment. I'm going to distinguish these on 3 matrices: setting, character, and theme. Now, to be fair, this is going to take some time to discuss in depth, so to keep from trying your patience too much, what I'm going to do is lay out the setting, character, and theme of the traditional Godzilla model first, and then I'm going to come back throughout the track where it fits best to demonstrate how markedly different the setting, character, and theme of the Mothra model is. But first, let's talk about Godzilla. And we're going to begin by talking about setting. So Godzilla and the movies in the Godzilla model clearly want to be seen as taking place in the real world. In other words, our world, the world we live in, but with a very few significant changes. What if a giant monster came ashore? Other than the fact that the H-bomb tests awake and mutate a giant prehistoric monster, aside from that, right, Godzilla takes place in a recognizable vision of our world. It has people in it who think like us and share our experiences. Those people squabble and debate and disagree, and the point of the movie is watching what would happen if this terrible monster were to appear in our world. There's a deliberate, almost documentary-like feel to the way Godzilla is shot and edited, to foreground the idea that this is a realistic vision of an extreme event. Next, let's talk about character. In the Godzilla model, the main characters are the authority figures and experts whose knowledge and positions of responsibility obligate them to address the monster threat. Dr. Yamane is a brilliant paleontologist who recognizes Godzilla for what it is, and Dr. Serizawa is a gifted inventor who happens to have developed a superweapon capable of confronting the monster. The key decisions in the narrative are made by civil and military leaders trying to keep their people safe. And when we think about what those decisions might be, we arrive at the third distinguishing factor, theme. In the Godzilla model, the theme is man versus monster. It's not, as you might be tempted to suspect, man versus nature, because whatever ecological or environmental misconduct led to the emergence of monsters, the solution to the dramatic conflict isn't to solve that misconduct. You don't end the movie Godzilla with the characters deciding never to test H-bombs again. Rodan doesn't end with a newfound commitment to stopping drilling. Man's misbehavior creates monsters, but the movies end when the monsters are dispatched. After Varan the Unbelievable, screenwriter Shinichi Sekizawa said he was bored by the typical monster on the loose scenario. Godzilla, Rodan, Varan, the movies in the Godzilla mold were formula pictures, and he wanted to change that formula. His ambition, something no other screenwriter involved in giant monster movies anywhere else in the world was even considering, now seems elegantly simple and obvious: to interconnect the human dramas with the monster action. In other words, the human characters didn't have to be reacting to monster mayhem. It could work the other way around. You could distribute monster effect sequences throughout the picture, not just concentrated at the end, and still have a coherent narrative that continued to develop equally well when the actors were stuntmen in rubber suits as when they were trained thespians. He turned the pattern on its head. In the old paradigm, monsters threaten people and people resolve it. In Sekizawa's new iteration, people threaten people, and monsters resolve it. And the principal person threatening other people is Clark Nelson, an almost cartoonish villain played by Jerry Ito. He just needs a sinister mustache to twirl to complete the archetype. Jerry Ito was a Japanese-American born in New York in 1927. He grew up in California, raised by a family of entertainers. During the war, he enlisted with the American Navy and ended up, ironically, as part of the first occupation forces in Japan. After the war, he returned to the U.S. and became a stage actor in Broadway shows like All the King's Men and Tea House of the August Moon. He was visiting family in Japan in 1956 when he fell into various acting opportunities there and more or less decided to stay. Ito couldn't speak Japanese, however. He spoke his Japanese dialogue here phonetically. Toho frequently employed Westerners living in Japan to play such roles, the primary requirement being a Caucasian look, not necessarily acting ability. Allegedly, director Ishiro Honda was so frustrated by Ito's poor Japanese dialogue that he never used him again. In addition to his principal role here in Mothra, around the same time Ito also appeared in The Manster, an American horror film that was shot in Japan with a Japanese cast and crew, but filmed in English. It was shown in Japan in 1961, the same year as Mothra, but got its U.S. debut the following year. I've been making a big deal about Shinichi Sekizawa because he's one of my heroes, and I think his genius in recognizing what Japanese monster movies should be about was what turned Toho's films into such amazing, enduring, and distinctive works of art. But he's just one of the pieces of the puzzle here, and if we want to celebrate what makes Mothra special, we also need to talk about two other people, director Ishiro Honda and special effects supervisor Eiji Tsuburaya. I'll come back to talk about Tsuburaya's biography later in the film when his contributions really start to take over the frame, but now is a good time to say a few words about the life and career of Ishiro Honda. We can start by listing some of the highlights of his storied output. Godzilla, Rodan, The H-Man, Battle in Outer Space, Mothra, King Kong vs. Godzilla, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Frankenstein Conquers the World, War of the Gargantuas, King Kong Escapes, Destroy All Monsters. And that's just a few of the big names, chosen to give you a sense of what I mean when I say he is the greatest monster movie director of all time. But when I say that, I am unfairly reducing the scope of his artistry down to a narrow slice. You see, with some filmmakers, their names became synonymous with a particular genre or style of film, and if I were to say their names, you'd immediately conjure to mind an image of what a film by that person would be like, and chances are you'd be right on the money. Alfred Hitchcock, Mario Bava, Terence Fisher, Dario Argento, Claude Chabrol. But as much as Honda's career came to be defined by giant monsters, that doesn't tell the whole story. As he rose up within Toho's corporate system to director, the basic assumption was that he'd largely specialize in making romantic dramas. But there was this fluky event in 1954 when he was assigned to work on something called Godzilla, and he ended up bringing such energy and passion to the thing that it became an unprecedented international smash hit. The studio set out to make more such things in its wake, hoping to cash in on a craze. But the first few efforts in that direction didn't involve Honda. Directors were supposed to be a dime a dozen. The corporate studio system assumed that it was the overall recipe that mattered, not the cook. If you had a good marketable idea and everyone did their job competently, you'd get a good movie. At least that was the idea. Eventually, through the normal order of things, Honda had a second shot at it with Rodan in 1956, and that film also went through the roof in terms of audience response and international sales. Suddenly, Toho had to rethink their whole stance, because it was clear that having Honda in the director's chair was what made some films huge, great successes. There was an intermediate period during which he alternated between making dramas and making monster films, but it didn't take long for him to be essentially typecast in making these. But it wasn't his deep abiding passion. In fact, apparently, he took Jerry Ito aside at one point and confided that he was frustrated at being exclusively associated with monster films. This film is a little vague on how exactly the natives of Infant Island managed to survive the radiation. It was a bigger focus of the novelization, and the filmmakers had intended to flesh it out more on screen, with more material set in the mold forest. The art department had constructed this set and its riot of Technicolor hues based on some microscopic photos of real mold that Ishiro Honda had provided as inspiration. However, the expense of building and destroying the miniature Newkirk City for the finale ate up too much of the budget, and there wasn't enough money and time to shoot all the planned scenes in the mold forest. What we're left with is a vague suggestion that somehow the Infant Islanders are making some kind of juice that has anti-radiation effects. This was an idea that would obsess Shinichi Sekizawa. He would return many times to the idea of a South Pacific island where the locals have a magic berry juice with supernatural properties. It comes up in King Kong vs. Godzilla, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, and Son of Godzilla. Sekizawa had spent most of the war stranded on South Pacific islands, hungry and unhappy, so we can see bits of autobiographical details peeking through the edges, and it's not hard to see why this notion would take root in his imagination. And Sekizawa's imagination was a bit like a weed. It could take root anywhere and thrive in all kinds of conditions. Part of what makes this script so strong is that it originated with other writers, and then Sekizawa would come in and work his unique personal magic on the best ingredients that they'd come up with. Speaking of seeing Sekizawa rework other people's ideas, there was a point a few years after this when he was contracted by Nippon Television to write a television miniseries about a giant monster to cash in on the whole craze. The show was called Aegon, Atomic Dragon. 4 episodes were made in 1964, but they weren't seen for years afterwards because Toho's lawyers objected based on a no-compete clause in Sekizawa's contract. Toho's chief complaint wasn't that Sekizawa was writing a monster show. I mean, that didn't make them happy, but the monster show Sekizawa wrote was so obviously copied from Godzilla. The rip-off aspects are blunt. Scientists investigating the aftershock of a terrible typhoon discover a giant dinosaur that was dormant in the sea but awoken and mutated by nuclear testing. The monster looks just like Godzilla. It has atomic breath just like Godzilla. The show recreates certain iconic moments from Godzilla almost shot for shot. It has the elderly scientist who diagnoses the monster problem, his lovely daughter, 2 strapping young men vying for her favors. I mean, if I stopped talking here, you'd probably wonder why they needed to hire superstar Sekizawa at all. Except Sekizawa tweaks that to his way of thinking. Aegon is full of oddball character humor, like a scene where the reporter hero Goro gets upset because the female hero's dog is also named Goro. And yeah, Sekizawa has changed things to make a reporter the main character, and he has the nickname Snapping Turtle, because once he gets a bite on a story, he doesn't let go. Fukuda coins a phrase, the shobijin, or little beauties, and he helpfully explains the etymology of this portmanteau word. It's one of several terms used to describe the little women over the years. The term used in the title of the novel was Hako Yosai, Luminous Fairies, and then in the text, the fairies were called the Alienus. When Sekizawa started adapting the screenplay, before he came up with the term shobijin, his first name for the fairies was Pichi. Much later, when Mothra and her priestesses were revived for the 1990s Toho films, the fairies were then called the Cosmos. Still with me so far? Well, for many, they are simply the Peanuts. the stage name of the singing duo who played them on screen here and in 2 sequels. The Peanuts were the sisters Emi and Yumi Ito, no relation to Jerry Ito. By any name, they are gloriously iconic, and in many ways the Peanuts are the real stars of the film, more than the monster Mothra or Frankie Sakai or any of the human cast. It's tempting to think that the roles were written for them, but that's not quite true. Before there was any thought of casting the Peanuts, the novelization version had developed the idea of 4 Luminous Fairies, and when Shinichi Sekizawa first started adapting that story into a screenplay, his first take on it was to reduce the number of fairies from 4 to 3, and he thought of them as extraterrestrial aliens of some sort. The Ito sisters were a popular recording duo that began professional singing in 1959. Twins are, for some reason, especially rare in Japan, and so they had an extra special hook along with their innate charm and talent. The Peanuts had been discovered singing in a Nagoya nightclub and were given a chance to try recording. Their very first single, Kuroi Hanabera, hit #1 on the Japanese pop music charts in 1959, and this got them signed by Columbia Records, and they started recording covers of American pop songs. Columbia was looking for publicity and cross-marketing opportunities to help promote the Peanuts singing career, and meanwhile, Columbia was also cultivating a relationship with Toho to release their science fiction films in the US, and Toho was making a big-budget monster movie with a key role built around, how many girls did you have in mind, Shinichi? So, Sekizawa changed the Shobijin to 2 little beauties, Toho cast the Peanuts, and a legend was born. The movie would serve to help publicize the American release of the album The Peanuts Around the World, and the publicity for that album would help promote the movie. Now, this is our first taste of Mothra's song. This is one of several variants that appear throughout the score, in addition to the famous rendition by the Peanuts as a bizarre stage musical number. The centrality of Mothra's song to the score is why this film does not feature music by Akira Ifukube. The legendary composer was Ishiro Honda's main go-to musician, but Ifukube refused to write a pop song for the Peanuts. So instead, Honda turned to Yuji Koseki, who had scored Eagle of the Pacific for him a few years earlier. And, well, Koseki was also under contract at Columbia Records, so that helped. And he was a friend of Shinichi Sekizawa. They were, in fact, fellow lyric writers. Koseki had gotten his start in music busking in a street band as a harmonica player, and he was signed to Columbia at age 21, writing classical compositions and later pop songs, and eventually moving to film scoring as well. As I mentioned when we first sat down together, Toho reissued this film in 1974 as part of the Champion Festival. The 1974 version of Mothra runs a trim 62 minutes, shaving a full 39 minutes off the total runtime. Unsurprisingly, most of the savings came from the material at the top of the film, before the monster mayhem begins in earnest. In fact, the 1974 Mothra gets to this scene a full 17 minutes earlier than in this original full-length cut. And this is achieved principally through efficient narrative compression. In this original version, the expedition probes Infant Island twice, with Chujo having a weird experience and then going back to intentionally try to encounter the fairies. After Nelson's failed attempt to kidnap them, the film spends some time discussing Nelson's motives before he secretly returns to the island to grab the girls. In the 1974 cut, all that gets boiled down to a single excursion by the full expedition, almost immediately followed by Nelson's return trip. So I'd like to return here to my discussion of how this film established a new model for how to make monster movies, a new template, which I'm calling the Mothra Model. And the first dimension I'd like to explore on that model is setting. You'll recall I said before that the previous template, the Godzilla model, positions the monster action within a recognizably realistic version of our world. By contrast, Mothra is suffused with a sense of whimsy and wonder. A host of weird and fantastical things have occurred long before a giant moth starts wiggling its way to Japan. To watch Godzilla is to suspend your disbelief about one central idea. But to watch Mothra is to accept from the outset that it takes place in a fantasy world that differs from ours in numerous ways. Mothra asks its audience that they take as given the existence of a lost civilization, a giant moth, and miniature people. From where these weird fantastical elements came from is not the issue, but rather the interaction between them and the normal world. And as exhibit number 1, let me enter into evidence this absurdity, the whole idea of Rolisica. The name is meant to evoke a mashup of Russia and America, and when we ultimately see its capital city, Newkirk, the place looks like San Francisco and New York had a baby. But within the narrative context of the film, we're supposed to imagine Rolisica as existing between Eastern Asia and Europe, kind of where Russia is. Let's pause for a moment and let that sink in. This movie was made in 1961. At this point in time, in the real world, the defining geopolitical event was the Cold War, a struggle between Russia and America. Pretty much every developed nation in the world was expected to sign up a military or political alignment with either Russia or America, one or the other, not both. The H-bomb testing that made Infant Island such a radioactive wasteland only occurred in the real world as part of the arms race between Russia and America. The space program that in the real world led to the development of rocket ships to the moon, of the kind seen in Battle in Outer Space, was a space race between Russia and America. Not long after this movie came out, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear destruction thanks to the Cold War. But this movie takes place in a world where not only did the Cold War apparently not happen, but the key countries that were responsible for it are somehow the same place. I'm not saying that every movie made in this era had to reference the Cold War. Breakfast at Tiffany's came out around the same time. It doesn't deal with the Cold War. But come on, the central drama of this film is a conflict between Clark Nelson's commercial interests in his personal property rights versus the negative consequences that would have for the national security and safety of the Japanese people. Personal property rights versus collective interests. On paper, this would appear to be a Cold War allegory, an ideological parable about American capitalism versus communist socialism. Except that's not how it plays at all. In no way does Mothra come across as a political allegory about ideologies. Instead, what we have is a morality play about the moral virtues of good Japanese people challenged by the selfishness of non-Japanese villains. So we have this trio of villains. We've talked about Jerry Ito, an American immigrant who didn't speak Japanese. His immediate henchman, on the left there, is played by Tetsu Nakamura, a Canadian immigrant with a strong command of Japanese, even though it was not his native language. Because he spoke with a somewhat foreign accent, Ishiro Honda had previously cast him as a Chinese gangster in The H-Man. It's less overt here, but the general impression given is that Tetsu isn't a proper Japanese, but some other kind of Asian. The third member of their team is played by Osman Yusuf as Nelson's bodyguard. Yusuf was from Turkey, and in his day job he operated a Turkish bath in Tokyo and served as a pro wrestling referee. The name Rolisica appears in the novelization, so we can't fully credit Shinichi Sekizawa with the idea. Indeed, it appears he tried to jettison it and set the finale in the actual United States, in the real New York City, but that didn't fly for some undocumented reason. But we can acknowledge and respect how Sekizawa made use of the concept of Rolisica, even if he wasn't the originator of the notion. Now, there may be some of you grumbling that I've made too much of this, that the film doesn't explicitly ask us to believe that the US and Russia don't exist, or that the Cold War didn't happen. If that's what you want to tell yourself, that's fine. But this film is pretty overt in making Rolisica look like the US while being physically located where Russia should be, and at no point introduces any plot points, dialogue asides, or any details of any kind that contradict my reading.
Mothra! Mothra!
The desk chief is played by one of Japan's most venerated actors, the distinguished Takashi Shimura. For his role in Akira Kurosawa's Ikaru in 1952, the New York Times called him the best actor in the world. And a few years later, when he played Dr. Yamane in Godzilla, the same reviewer in the same paper said none of that film's cast could act. Shimura proceeded to appear in both Kurosawa's art house films like Seven Samurai and Redbeard, and Honda's sci-fi epics like Mothra and Frankenstein Conquers the World. The Western media, so eager to draw a bright line between serious cinema and commercial trash, didn't know what to do with this and just tried to ignore it. A critical source of inspiration and influence on Mothra was King Kong. This is in no small part because King Kong was the primary trendsetter for the entire genre of giant monster movies. If this was the business you worked in, you had to have some kind of respect and admiration for the movie that launched it all. But there are several distinctive points of overlap with specific moments in King Kong that are worth noting, and this is perhaps the most prominent. The whole Secret Fairies show setup echoes a key story beat from King Kong. The promoter goes on an expedition to a mysterious island, finds an almost supernatural wonder, and brings it back to show off to a ticket-paying mass audience at a live show. Which is pretty interesting if you stop to think about it. If the idea was to have the villainous Clark Nelson selfishly exploit the people of Infant Island for his own benefit, having him turn the fairies into a musical stage show seems like an odd choice unless you were trying to evoke memories of King Kong. I mean, the natives of Infant Island are immune to radiation. You could enslave them as a radiation-proof workforce, or a radiation-proof army for that matter. You could mass-produce their magic berry juice as an anti-radiation drug. You could sell Mothra's silk as a super-powerful cloth. Lots of possibilities for the unethical businessman to consider, whereas putting them on stage seems like small beans. Apparently, the idea of entertainment gone wrong was something that really got under Sekizawa's skin, because he returns to this well repeatedly in future scripts. King Kong vs. Godzilla is about a TV show advertiser who thinks he can goose his show's ratings by sponsoring a giant monster fight. In Mothra vs. Godzilla, an evil promoter gets a hold of an unhatched Mothra egg and charges the general public to come look at it. In Godzilla vs. Gigan, an invading race of cockroaches from outer space decide the best way to take over the Earth is by building a Godzilla-themed amusement park. If you get a chance, seek out the film Giants and Toys. It's a 1958 Japanese comedy directed by Yasuzo Masamura about the absurdity of the cutthroat world of advertising. It's not a special effects film, it isn't by Toho, but it really helps put in context what was going on in Sekizawa's world when he wrote this. Plus also, it's awesome. Another opportunity for synergy involving the Peanuts was their iconic song. Because whereas the Peanuts were a singing act trying their hands at acting, Shinichi Sekizawa was himself more of a song lyricist than he was a screenwriter, which is odd for us to think of today, especially for people like myself who really only have access to Sekizawa's movie work, but he made more money writing songs than he did writing movies. He didn't, however, write this song. Instead, Shinichi Sekizawa wrote an outline of what kind of a song he had in mind, and then Ishiro Honda and a college student named Susumu Ike helped write lyrics in a sort of pidgin Malay to sound foreign and exotic. And musician Yuji Koseki crafted a haunting lyrical tune around it, and movie history was made. The Peanuts appeared in 10 movies in all before their retirement in 1975, 3 of which featured them as Mothra's priestesses. So yeah, 30% of their entire movie career was spent singing to a giant moth. In addition to playing miniature women in science fiction thrillers, they were also adept at comedy, and their first comedy feature was distributed on the lower half of the double bill with King Kong vs. Godzilla. The uncanny aspect of their twinhood is used to great effect here. They look alike, but their voices are just slightly different from one another, and when they sang or spoke in unison, it sounds like a reverb effect. Later, we'll see the two Shobijin speak at the same time or sometimes alternate their dialogue in perfect synchrony, as if they shared a single mind. The Peanuts returned as the Shobijin for Mothra vs. Godzilla, also scripted by Shinichi Sekizawa. And in that return appearance, Sekizawa gives them a chance to sing this iconic Mothra song, but in a very different context. They get to sing in the peace of their home island. As I mentioned before, that film has a villainous promoter who clearly wants to exploit them as an attraction, but that's not a plot point that ends up getting developed on screen. However, it was their next appearance in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster that takes the cake. In that film, also scripted by Sekizawa, the Shobijin reprise their Secret Fairies show willingly as guest stars on a TV program called Where Are They Now? In that film, they turn up like C-list celebrities on the talk show circuit, or cultural ambassadors using pop entertainment to reignite public interest in their island's culture, like the infant island version of Shen Yun. It's so gloriously audacious to go from this film's portrayal of them as abused, mistreated, and victimized, forced against their will to perform on stage, to then switcheroo into voluntarily appearing before an appreciative audience because people genuinely want to hear what they have to say. I'd like to return to my larger agenda of discussing how this film marked a sharp left turn away from the model of storytelling defined by Godzilla, and the next piece to discuss is character. As I mentioned previously, in the Godzilla model, it's the authorities and experts who dispatch the monsters. And crucially, it's because they are the authorities and experts that they do so. In Godzilla, Dr. Serizawa is literally the only person in the world who can save us from Godzilla because he alone has invented the oxygen destroyer. Resolving the plot and ending Godzilla's reign of terror means getting Dr. Serizawa to agree to use his weapon. But in the Mothra model, the central dramatic conflict isn't the monster. I mean, Mothra hasn't even shown up yet. We're 40 minutes into this thing. Instead, the central dramatic conflict is that Clark Nelson is mistreating the two miniature priestesses. That's a human conflict, and the appropriate authority figures and experts to resolve it would be lawyers and diplomats. But not only are the authorities and experts unable to stop this human bad guy from mistreating other humans, their failure's not even something the film tries to dramatize on screen. In the Mothra model, the main characters are ordinary people who happen to get swept up in events because of circumstance. Our three heroes end up confronting the threat not because it's their job to do so, but because it is their moral duty. That's a subtle but critical distinction. They do what they do because they are good-hearted people compelled to do the right thing, not because they alone among the people in the world happen to be best suited to the task. Now, in addition to King Kong, another significant movie to compare and contrast is the 1958 fantasy classic The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. It was directed by Nathan Juran, but really the reason it's remembered is for wall-to-wall special effects by Ray Harryhausen. This was a breakout work for Harryhausen, a full-color spectacle full of fantasy and aimed at that all-ages family audience very similar to Mothra. But where Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and Mothra most obviously intersect is in how Sinbad is about a selfish man who puts an entire nation at risk for his own private benefit, and in so doing he threatens the life of a miniature woman who's carried around in a bejeweled carrying case. Like many films of its era, Seventh Voyage of Sinbad gets much of its thrills from the juxtapositions of scale. The miniature women, normal-sized people, and giant monsters all share the frame and interact. Now, I could go off on a tangent here about this weird mid-century obsession with scale. Miniature people appear in films like The Three Worlds of Gulliver, Attack of the Puppet People, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, Fantastic Voyage, and The Incredible Shrinking Man, while giant-sized animals occupy the screen in Them, Tarantula, It Came From Beneath the Sea, the giant Gila monster, and the deadly mantis. But to be honest, what's really going on with all these oversized or undersized things isn't so much some secret psychology of the era, but the simple aesthetic fascination in special effects for their own sake. And here's the thing of it. Nowadays, very nearly every special effect is created in the same way, through CGI, computer-generated imagery. Whether it's Keanu Reeves kung fu fighting in The Matrix, or superheroes battling supervillains, or Jedis with their lightsabers, today's effects are all some flavor of CGI. So the thrill is in the skill of the execution. But back in the middle 20th century, special effects were a more handmade and personalized affair. If you wanted to get something on screen, you had to stage it in front of a camera somehow. Every effect had to be conceived individually and caused to happen in some way, which is a very different kind of aesthetic pleasure. It means part of the fun of watching a pre-CGI effects-forward film is in marveling how they do that. It's like seeing a magician. We know that the magician doesn't really violate the laws of physics, doesn't really have magic powers, but the fun of it, the thrill of it, is in seeing something you know can't be what you thought it was, but you saw it anyway. Great special effects create compelling magical illusions, too, that we can admire for their artistry. And this was Eiji Tsuburaya's great gift. And it gets misunderstood at times if you try to meet his films with an expectation of photographic realism. This is a fundamentally different aesthetic from that one that undergirds the use of CGI. We are thrilled most by Tsuburaya's visions, not when we are fooled into thinking they are real, but by recognizing that they are not, by marveling at the craftsmanship and ingenuity that caused them to be put on screen. And so as we come up on the birth of Mothra, very nearly at the halfway point in the film, Tsuburaya brings together miniatures, optical printing, animation, matte paintings, blue screen composites, and puppets, together with lighting effects and vivid scenery by the art directors Takeo Kita and Teruaki Abe, carefully coordinated between Tsuburaya's effects footage and Honda's live-action footage, backed by Yuji Koseki's increasingly insistent score, to give us this absolutely marvelous vision of a giant caterpillar bursting forth from an Easter egg. I mentioned a few minutes ago how the Western press struggled to reconcile the two poles of Japanese export cinema, Kurosawa art house films and Honda's giant monster movies. Returning to that thought, here's a fun fact for you. In this era, Ishiro Honda was the most commercially successful director in Japan. I mean, sure, Akira Kurosawa was an internationally celebrated art house filmmaker whose name remains a signpost of great cinema. But, his films are not always crowd-pleasing blockbusters, and on the global circuit, they were most usually found playing in specialized art houses in mostly urban markets to select audiences. Meanwhile, Ishiro Honda's films were massive hits at home, and when they played globally, they were shown in mainstream theaters to general audiences, aided in large part by being dubbed rather than subtitled. And Mothra, in particular, can be seen as kicking off a decade-long run of enormous box office success. Mothra brought in 281 million yen at the Japanese box office in 1961, an unqualified hit of monster proportions, if you'll forgive the pun. Now, it's been observed that later Toho films in the 1960s didn't surpass the high mark set by this in King Kong vs. Godzilla, but let's keep that in context. Mothra was the only film of its kind made in Japan in 1961, so that 281 million in ticket sales represents a pie that Mothra got to gorge on all by itself. By comparison, well, let's pick a year, 1966. Toho released two major monster movies that year, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster and War of the Gargantuas, and these had to share the nation's screens with Gamera, Gamera vs. Baragon, Daimagen, Wrath of Daimagen, Return of Daimagen, Yokai Monsters Along with Ghosts, Yokai Monsters 100 Monsters, The Magic Serpent, and Terror Beneath the Sea. All the while, Ultraman battled giant monsters on weekly television. Add to that the 8 major Japanese giant monster films released theatrically by various studios in the 4 years between 1962 and 1966. This level of aggressive competition only increased. The pie was now being split among many hungry rivals. But crucially, when you aggregate together the box office returns of those myriad competitors, what you see is that, yes, the pie is being shared, but it is also a substantially larger pie overall. Toho was growing the market. Even discounting the competition from enemy studios, Toho's own staff had good reason to compete against themselves. Investing all their efforts in a single lavish production like Mothra not only meant that the film stood to reap all the potential rewards of success, but it also risked catastrophic losses if something went wrong. Distributing that risk across a number of smaller monster movies meant that no single film was likely to be a huge blockbuster, but at the same time, there was a better chance that some of them would be modest successes. Films like Mothra and King Kong vs. Godzilla had been one-of-a-kind moments, which enjoyed very little competition and some unique marketing advantages. Their successors would instead be an array of diversified product lines of reduced expectations but greater volume. Monsters had become big business. Tomoyuki Tanaka spent the 1960s making as many science fiction films as humanly possible, with an eye towards economy and efficiency, in the hopes of finding something else that clicked. Now, just a quick aside so I'm not misunderstood. When I single out the 1960s as a key decade in Japanese fantasy film, I'm not trying to signal any criticism of the 1970s films. It's just that in the 1970s, there was a structural collapse in the Japanese film industry as a whole, a catastrophic implosion in a single industry. That means that films made in Japan in the 1970s really can't be compared to those in the 1960s fairly. It's not comparing apples to apples. I'm really quite fond of the creativity and style that shines through the 1970s Japanese fantasy films, especially those from Toho, and I don't wish my remarks to be interpreted as a backhanded swipe. Previously, I referred to Frankie Sakai as a slapstick comedian, and that isn't quite fair, at least as far as how he's used here. I've spent quite a lot of time studying slapstick comedy, and one defining characteristic is how slapstick violence is typically cartoonishly excessive and directed at the comedian. It's hard to get people to laugh at cruelty, so you don't want the slapstick violence to come across as injuries to others. Shinichi Sekizawa often depicts a kind of slapstick violence, but it's directed at the bad guys, and it's generally not so much cartoonishly excessive, but rather realistically scaled down. Frankie Sakai batters people on the head with a rolled-up set of papers. It's not going to hurt much. It's just annoying. And then he opts for spastic flailing and kicking, uncoordinated physical action in keeping with his character, but which might be hyperactive enough to have a genuine effect. There's a great moment in GODZLLA, the three-headed monster, where the bad guys sneak into the house where the heroes are. They come in with their guns drawn. And in the chaos, one of the heroes strikes one of the baddies over the head with a wrench, and he just goes, "Ow!" and clutches his head. You get so conditioned from movies to seeing the good guys throw one punch to a bad guy and pow, he's knocked unconscious. It's such a cliche you don't even think about it, even though any fan of boxing knows you need more than one punch to knock a guy out. But Sekizawa finds comedy in the ironic distance between what we expect and what we get. Chujo is played by Japanese actor Hiroshi Koizumi, who manages to play a roughly similar character in all three of Mothra's first screen appearances. He was just really good at playing a kindly scientist, I guess. Toho had groomed him as a star for years through a program called New Faces. This was an idea by which one of Japan's biggest and most prolific movie studios sought out undiscovered talent. Ordinary members of the public, untrained amateurs, would enroll in this competition, and then the studio would pick out the ones they thought had star potential. The winners would then receive acting training while being put before the public in various films, starting with small roles, to see who clicked. Koizumi had been working as a TV announcer when the New Face program catapulted him into starring roles in teen-oriented pictures in the 1950s. The elder scientist, Dr. Harada, is played by Ken Uehara. Uehara came from a privileged background, and with his classically handsome features and musical ability, he very quickly established himself as a movie star in the mid-1930s. He started at Shochiku, working in lightweight comedies, and later migrated to Toho to work with major movie makers like Kon Ichikawa, Kaisuke Kinoshita, and Mikio Naruse, as well as the odd film here or there for Ishiro Honda. Now, I haven't said much about Tomoyuki Tanaka, the most prolific producer of fantasy entertainment in cinema history. He was a business major who started at Toho as a cameraman, and Tanaka eventually became a producer, and in 1952, he headed a seminal drama called Farewell Rabaul. I call it seminal because, although the movie itself isn't all that well remembered, it united in one production Tomoyuki Tanaka, Ishiro Honda, and Eiji Tsuburaya, as well as many of the actors who would continue to populate Toho's science fiction and fantasy productions through the 1960s and 70s. Tanaka led this cycle for Toho until 1995. The female lead is Kyoko Kagawa. She'd worked with Frankie Sakai previously in a comedy called My Friend Death, but unlike Sakai, she wasn't especially known for comedy work. She was more oriented around highbrow art films like Sancho the Bailiff and The Bad Sleep Well, and she was often cast as Toshiro Mifune's wife or lover. When she got married in 1963, however, she decided to end her movie career and became a housewife. As a pointless bit of meaningless trivia, the man she married in real life was a reporter. We've been watching several scenes now of the Mothra caterpillar swimming to Tokyo, and all of these scenes were filmed in something called the Big Pool. And yes, the name does signal that there was also a small pool. The Big Pool was constructed on Toho's lot in 1960 under Tsuburaya's direction. It was first used for a film called Tempest Over the Pacific, a war film in which Tsuburaya once again restaged the attack on Pearl Harbor using miniatures. It's 43,000 square feet in size, 262 feet wide at its widest, 210 feet deep at its deepest. It has a 46-foot-high concrete wall serving as the sky, which can be painted as needed depending on the shot. Electric motors generate artificial waves, and since water can't be miniaturized to help disguise the scale of the water, Tsuburaya would work in the largest scale miniatures he could manage, and film at fast frame rates so the action would be slowed down, lending a sense of gravity and size. Unfortunately for the crew, actual real live fish lived in the tank, despite all attempts to remove them. Between the fish and the real bugs that were attracted to the water, nature had a way of intruding in and ruining many an expensive shot. Ishiro Honda was born in 1911, the youngest of 5 siblings. In 1933, he joined a company called Photochemical Laboratory, or PCL, which would later become Toho. But just as his career was getting started, he was drafted to fight in China in 1938, the first of 3 times he was conscripted to the Imperial Army. When he eventually completed his various military service and returned home in 1946, he found his close friend and neighbor, Akira Kurosawa, recently promoted to director. Honda joined Kurosawa's team at Toho, working as an assistant director on such films as Stray Dog. The thing was, Honda had started at PCL first, and if it hadn't been for his military service, he'd have been the senior director overseeing Kurosawa. There was a little professional jealousy there, but Honda's and Kurosawa's temperaments differed significantly. Kurosawa was a restless artist, seeking new opportunities for self-expression on projects he initiated and pioneering new techniques. Honda didn't pursue his own projects, but took what Toho assigned him, which in large measure meant what producer Tomoyuki Tanaka assigned him, with whom he had a close partnership. As contrasted with Kurosawa's approach with actors, Honda would act out the physicality of scenes for his actors, showing them what he wanted them to do and having them mimic him, much as Fritz Lang had done back in the silent era. This was not a technique in much favor in the 1960s, and one that some actors bristled at. Consequently, he kept coming back again and again to a subset of actors he trusted and felt comfortable working with, and he frequently hosted them socially at his home. As a stylist, Honda wasn't a showboater, but his skill is evident in the fact that he made so many films of such different fields. The litany of special effects films directed by Honda goes on, but each one has its own aesthetic stance. Whereas Kurosawa sometimes shot his pictures using multiple cameras all at once, so the actors had to be fully in character throughout a scene rather than play to the camera, Honda did not have that luxury. He had a single camera, and he typically set up each shot individually, rather than shooting a master take and then coverage for dialogue close-ups. He cut in his head, shot what he needed, rather than a lot of footage for the editor to piece together later. This was the same way that Alfred Hitchcock worked. But it was a slog. He was on set 10-hour days, 6 days a week, cranking out footage. In his book Mushroom Clouds and Mushroom Men, author Peter H. Brothers relays a story from Honda's wife Kimi that Ishiro would leave a copy of whatever script he was to work on next out on the table, so she couldn't help but see it. Kimi Honda, you see, was a former script continuity supervisor. They'd met through Kurosawa. By leaving the script out, Ishiro knew that she'd read it and share her wisdom and insights without him having to ask her. Kind of a passive-aggressive move, if you ask me, but it is touching how much he needed and relied on her input. Honda had fallen in love with movies as a child, and he would sneak into the theaters to soak up whatever was playing. His favorites were historical dramas, and then he'd go home and retell the stories to his father, whose religion forbade him from going to the movies. But Ishiro was such a good storyteller, his father indulged his secret passion, even though it was against the rules for a boy Ishiro's age to go to the theater alone. Back when Honda first started at PCL, they'd expected him to develop into a director of romantic dramas based on his personality and what seemed to be at that time his aptitude. Indeed, he made a couple dozen such things, which are largely forgotten and unseen today because they are so eclipsed by what he did with special effects and monsters. If anything, that's the most striking thing about Honda's legacy. He was drawn to realism, and in his early career, up to and including Godzilla, one of his greatest strengths is the ability to bring documentary-style realism to his films. But then he becomes known and celebrated and remembered as this poet of giant irradiated monsters and miniature women. He made monster movies because Toho wanted him to, and Toho wanted him to because he was a genius at them. Mothra's arrival in mainland Japan manifests with a major set piece on a bridge. This marks a less obvious point of intersection with King Kong, insofar as there is a moment in the 1933 King Kong when Kong is broken through the giant barrier the natives used to wall him into the interior of Skull Island and is going on a rampage through the native village. The camera lingers on a small child right in Kong's path, and the frantic mother swoops in to grab the child out of harm's way just in the nick of time. Whether anyone was consciously adopting ideas from Kong here or not, this kind of moment is very much a signature move for Ishiro Honda. In nearly every one of his monster films, there is a comparable moment of experiencing the terror of the monster from a single victim's point of view. This bridge scene is referenced in the 1995 film Gamera, Guardian of the Universe, which also features a scene in which a child is trapped on a bridge as a giant monster attacks, and the hero rushes out into danger to help swoop the kid to safety. What's interesting about all this is how the film fully expects and is correct about the fact that audiences will sympathize with and side with the monster, even as she endangers children, kills people, causes untold property destruction, and generally lays waste to everything in her path. It's a tricky balancing act. Previous films played similar games, and obviously King Kong is the central touch point for that approach, but in the end King Kong dies. Same for Rodan. Maybe you feel sorry for the monster, but in the end they die. Not Mothra. We're headed towards a finale where the heroes actively help the monster achieve her goal, let her fly away unmolested while waving goodbye and inviting her back. This is Sekizawa's audacious contribution. This is an odd little sequence in which Chujo's younger brother Shinji attempts to rescue the Shobijin and gets himself tied up for his troubles. I call it odd because it's a bit of a time waster. It doesn't really advance any part of the plot. It's an artifact left over from an earlier draft of the script in which Shinji's attempted heroics actually did affect the plot. We'll talk more about this alternate ending later and why it was abandoned, but In this alternate version, Nelson and his goons don't just tie up Shinji, they actually take him with them when they flee Japan, and as a result, he's in a position to get loose and free the Shobijin from their shielded carrying case, thereby re-establishing the psychic link with Mothra, allowing her to swoop in on Nelson's hiding place to rescue the girls. With this plotline gone, however, Shinji's exceedingly brief flirtation with danger just kind of sits there, though. So, when I first saw the 1974 Champion version, I assumed that this would be among the bits left on the cutting room floor. As you'll recall, in 1974, Toho hacked close to half the running time off this movie and reissued it as part of a special festival aimed at kids. And to get this down to a sprightly 62 minutes, anything non-essential was jettisoned. But here's the interesting bit. Ishiro Honda oversaw the recutting of the Champion editions. So the man who made this movie was tasked with fitting it into an hour-long slot. So the choices of what to keep and what to lose are not arbitrary, and they deserve the same kind of attention and respect that we give to Honda's original full-length cut. So let's ask the question. What was it about this sequence that deserved to be kept? I'll give you two answers. The first one's pretty superficial. Since the purpose of the 1974 cut was to appeal to young people, there was likely some thinking that including an actual child protagonist in the film was worthwhile. Certainly during the 1970s, Toho and their chief competitor for monster movie action Dai were casting children in these films, and compared to many of them, this child actor's really quite good. His name is Masami Tayama. He didn't grow up into an adult actor, though, but he did stay in show business. Apparently he became a professional singer. But there's another, more telling reason why Honda would have been inclined to keep Shinji's big scene intact, and it has to do with what I was talking about earlier regarding the shift in focus to characters motivated by moral principles rather than professional position. The essential thrust of the film is that the good guys are good because they do the right thing even when it gains them nothing, as compared to villains who are only motivated by personal gain even when it is wrong. That's the fundamental inflection point of the whole movie. So although Shinji's doomed act of heroism doesn't have any tangible plot significance, it absolutely has thematic significance. To be fair, though, this sequence also serves as a necessary bridge between two special effects scenes that would otherwise crash together awkwardly if you didn't fit at least something between them. We last saw Mothra smashing up a bridge and threatening a baby in its cradle, and in just a moment Mothra will descend on the Yokota military base. And in between, we don't just have Shinji's heroics, but the revelation that the Rolisican government has recognized the error of its ways and is no longer backing Nelson. That's an important piece of narrative development to get out of the way if the audience is going to be sufficiently concerned about Mothra's attack on Newkirk City in the finale. You don't want people sitting there thinking all Rolisicans are bastards. Which goes back to my earlier remarks about how this isn't pitched as an ideological battle, but rather as a moral one. This isn't about indicting a Rolisican frame of mind.
ねえ、大変よ。
分かってるよ。ネルソン逃亡。
何言ってんのよ。モスラが現れたのよ。
なんだって。モスラが？どこへ？
横田基地から東京に向かってんの。
I said before, Mothra had three daddies. We've talked about Shinichi Sekizawa and Ishiro Honda. It's high time we talked about Eiji Tsuburaya. Whereas Ishiro Honda privately grumbled about being typecast into making monster movies, this was what Tsuburaya lived for. This was the culmination of his life's ambitions. Well, it was the culmination of one of his life's ambitions, at least. Eiji Tsuburaya had started off training for a completely different career. At a young age, he was fascinated by airplanes, and although model planes would come to dominate his future career in photographic miniatures, at first his ambition was to fly the real things. He enrolled in flying school and paid his tuition with money he earned designing toys. He didn't get a career in aviation, though. After flight school, he studied electrical engineering, and he put that training to use as a screenwriter at what would become Kokatsu Studios. It was there, during the silent movie era, he first started to learn the craft of special effects. He was initially employed as a cameraman, and with his background in engineering and some prior work experience at a toy factory, he was given to fashion his own equipment and jerry-rig devices to achieve special pictorial effects impossible otherwise. He longed to improve upon the still primitive art of special effects, but there wasn't much support for his dreams in the industry at that time. Then in 1933 he had an epiphany. That was when King Kong came out, a film that was centrally about its effects, that made special effects the star of the show. He acquired a print of King Kong for his own personal use and spent his nights examining it, frame by frame, to reverse engineer its secrets. He approached his employers at the Nikatsu studio and implored them to authorize a full-scale attempt to develop the same techniques. In the rigid hierarchy of the Japanese film industry, Tsuburaya was one of that studio's more acclaimed cinematographers, but that was it. He was a talented technician. The executives could not imagine he had any business advice worth their attention, so his dreams were deferred. But here's the thing, even though he had to wait to be given the opportunity to indulge his fantasies of making a movie built around special effects, Tsuburaya was at that time a well-recognized and accomplished professional in the field. The next generation of special effects maestros, like Ray Harryhausen, had to see King Kong and then grow up into special effects geniuses to start making special effects movies in the 50s and 60s. When Tsuburaya saw King Kong in 1933, he wasn't some awestruck kid. He was already regarded as one of Japan's top movie cameramen. He was already established as an innovator who developed his own techniques and built his own tools. His name was already attached to an amazing litany of hit movies, and he was already one of the founders of what is today the Japanese Society of Cinematographers. So he was in a position to start rising to that challenge immediately. It put him a generational leg up on everyone else. The years went on, and Tsuburaya continued to distinguish himself as one of the best cameramen in the business. Toho Studios came into being in 1937, when a railroad magnate with a desire to be in the motion picture business orchestrated a merger of several smaller firms that, once fused, formed a formidable movie outfit. With an official mandate of modernization in progress, the Toho board sought out Tsuburaya to head up their technical division. And during the war years, Tsuburaya's special talents came into demand on propaganda films, but after the war ended, he was pretty much out of a job. The occupation had all but shut down film production entirely. Tsuburaya had a lot of time on his hands during this period and spent it experimenting. Tsuburaya taught himself optical effects and compositing techniques during the immediate post-war years. Then the occupation authorities got a hold of one of the films he'd contributed effects to. He'd shot some model miniatures of the attack on Pearl Harbor. His work on that footage included the first ever use of optical printing in a Japanese film. The Americans found the footage so convincing they concluded it had to be genuine. And if it was genuine, it meant that what Tsuburaya was passing off as quote-unquote special effects was really his involvement in some kind of spy ring. So he was under a cloud of being a possible war criminal, and Toho had to fire him to avoid further scandal. Eventually that cloud passed, and Toho president Iwao Mori set his sights on modernizing the film industry. He believed high-tech film production techniques were essential to streamline the making of films. Even romances and dramas had use of special production techniques. So Mori promptly rehired Tsuburaya. But in the interim, Tsuburaya hadn't been idle. He'd founded his own special effects production company. When he returned to Toho, Tsuburaya took his company with him, and he'd spend the rest of his professional life with his feet in both camps, commingling his work for Toho with the work he cultivated for his own company. Then, in 1954, Toho turned to Tsuburaya to help with an ambitious new project called Godzilla. This was Tsuburaya's long-awaited chance to marry his talent for miniatures with his dreams of monster movie havoc. Tsuburaya brought an astonishing host of creative ideas, innovations, inventions, and relentless hustle to the project, and he won the Japanese Film Technique Award for his work on Godzilla, the first of many such honors over his illustrious career as indisputably the founder of Japanese special effects. He even started insisting that his credit comes second only to Ishiro Honda's on their films to acknowledge him as a co-creator. And he could get away with such audacious demands and other eccentricities because he was a one-of-a-kind resource. Toho's biggest commercial successes depended on this man, so his whims were catered to. Mothra surpassed Godzilla as Toho's most expensive special effects film to date. Tsuburaya built the largest ever miniature set in Toho's history for this sequence in which Mothra sprawls across Tokyo. Practically 80% of the footage seen during this sequence are special effects shots photographed by Tsuburaya and his team. This is arguably his most madly ambitious work in a career defined by mad ambition. The model city was built at a scale of 1/20th, which means the buildings and so on were 20 times smaller than in real life. And to give you a sense of what this scale was like for the filmmakers, the Mothra caterpillar costume was 7 meters long, or 20 feet if you prefer, and tall enough that the operators inside could more or less stand up straight. It required a team of 12 operators, not all of them inside the thing, but the main operator inside was a stunt actor named Haruo Nakajima, and right behind him was another stuntman named Katsumi Tezuki. Nakajima was a veteran stuntman with such auspicious credits as Kurosawa's Seven Samurai to his name, and he was the primary stunt actor to play Godzilla from 1954 through 1972. Tezuka was a senior member of the studio's stunt staff, but his older body was little match for the rigors of the job, and so he was a secondary backup to Nakajima. Haruo Nakajima had been hired to play rubber-suited monsters thanks to his martial arts training, his background in stunt work, and his overall strength. And he took his job seriously. He also studied Tsuburaya's personal print of King Kong, and generally treated his monster acting as serious a job as anything he'd done for Akira Kurosawa. In addition to Seven Samurai, Nakajima had also been in Stray Dog. I am so grateful and privileged to have met Nakajima on a couple of occasions. He was such a lovely and generous man. He truly loved his work. That being said, I have to admit that according to Peter H. Brothers' book, Mushroom Clouds and Mushroom Men, Nakajima said that playing Mothra hardly counted as acting. The best they could do inside the larva costume was just run blindly forward and hope for the best. There are so many wonderful touches here, like this spark of light in the alleyway just now. What makes that moment clever is how Tsuburaya often uses lighting effects like that in his miniature work, and here it's Ishiro Honda thinking to incorporate the same kind of gimmick into the live-action footage as one more way of stitching these worlds together into a seamless whole. The silky thread that Mothra starts to spin was a special logistical challenge. Nowadays, this would be a cinch to do with CGI, but remember, Tsuburaya had no way to get it on screen if he couldn't make it happen in front of a camera, so he had to come up with an actual method of shooting out some kind of silken thread. So he got a kind of rubbery gum paste and a thing of compressed air and aerosolized the rubber. Unfortunately, for some of his technical team, there wasn't a lot of precision about where the aerosolized rubber would go, and they ruined a couple of crew members' clothes in the process. But a ruined shirt here or there is a minor inconvenience. Tsuburaya weathered a real tragedy during the film. Just as production started, he learned that his brother-in-law had died at the young age of 48 from a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. Tsuburaya's brother-in-law was a member of the team, too. His name was Hidasaburo Araki, and he had been the chief director of miniature photography. He and Eiji had known each other for decades. Ishiro Honda and Eiji Tsuburaya met for the first time in 1943 on a film called Kato's Flying Falcon Forces. Honda was an assistant director at the time. The two worked together variously in the late 1940s and early 1950s on war films, gradually cementing a partnership and friendship, but it was fraught at times. Honda was in awe of Tsuburaya when they met, but Tsuburaya didn't necessarily return the compliment. He was a grandstanding prima donna. I say that with love, mind you. He deserved to be showered with glory, but Honda's personal temperament was more staid, restrained, and subtle. But one of the reasons these movies shine like such gems is the tension between the different creative forces responsible for them. Left to his own devices, Shinichi Sekizawa could, and did, write some utterly lunatic stuff. And Eiji Tsuburaya had a tendency to go for goofy ideas untethered to the larger theme if he thought they were amusing. In short, movies dominated by their personalities could get very silly indeed, but Honda was a counterweight, a source of gravitas that kept them from getting too silly, while they brought a lightness of mood that wasn't necessarily native to Honda's temperament. And whatever interpersonal friction may have existed was never a problem. In a 1968 interview, Honda said that, quote, "On the set, our collaboration is always friendly." There's lots you can read between the lines of that very diplomatically worded statement, but 2 years later, when Tsuburaya died, Honda wrote a tribute to him in which he stated publicly that he considered Tsuburaya to be his true mentor, and not the man who'd actually trained him as a director, Kaijiro Yamamoto.
今度の復興に対し、ルシク国家は最大の援助を惜しめません。
で、原子熱製法の到着は成虫になるまでに間に合いましょうか。
ご安心ください。十分間に合います。
Another of the film's most iconic and memorable sequences is when the Mothra caterpillar cocoons herself around the newly constructed landmark Tokyo Tower. There had been an earlier plan to have the cocoon form around the Japanese Diet Building, but Tokyo Tower was a bigger and more internationally recognizable landmark. It is here, though, that we run across one of the odder and more nuanced connections to King Kong. Back when the idea was that Mothra would cocoon herself around the Diet Building, there was also the parallel idea that on Infant Island there would have been a structure that just coincidentally resembled the Diet, and Mothra was presumably attracted to the Diet because of its physical resemblance to a familiar place. None of this remains in the finished film, but bits of this idea resurfaced the following year in King Kong vs. Godzilla, where Shinichi Sekizawa and Ishiro Honda have King Kong lulled to sleep with the island's magic berry juice while slumping next to the Diet Building in an attempt to mimic the ceremonies Kong was used to on his island. Okay, so far so good. But then there's the 1976 King Kong by Dino De Laurentiis, which basically pilfers the original idea from Mothra in full, positing that Kong would be drawn towards New York's Twin Towers because they look like pillars from Kong's Island. But it's not an idea that appears in the original 1933 King Kong, so here we finally have an overlap between Mothra and King Kong that isn't something Mothra borrowed from Kong, but rather the reverse, an idea that Kong borrowed from Mothra. I mentioned before how one of Mothra's deeply felt influences is the idea of crossing characters and ideas over from one movie into another in what we would now call a shared cinematic universe. The most obvious element to do so is, of course, Mothra herself. She was brought back very quickly after the success of this film, but that sequel, Mothra vs. Godzilla, is also a Godzilla sequel, and every one of Mothra's subsequent screen appearances in the 1960s was in a movie top-lined by Godzilla. But there's a lesser remarked on element as well, these atomic heat cannons, or masers, or markalites, or whatever you want to call them. They go by different names because they show up again and again in Toho's films. The first time they appeared was in The Mysterians in 1957, and then again in Battle in Outer Space in 1958. In both of those early appearances, there was a lot of screen time spent explaining to the audience how there had been extensive research and development on this technology to repel the various alien invaders in those two films. Then Mothra comes along, and here we go. The military rolls out some atomic heat cannons to blast Mothra's cocoon with, but exactly zero effort is spent explaining these things to the audience. There's a brief mention that they're on loan from Rolisica, but that doesn't really explain anything about what they are or why they seem to exist in this world when no such weapon exists in the real world. Because why explain them? They were explained already back in The Mysterians and Battle in Outer Space. Come on, people, keep up! And that's the essence of what a cinematic universe is, the notion of expecting your audience to carry around a certain backlog of prior exposition so you don't need to keep explaining everything, you can just get on with using those ideas. To me, at least a part of the appeal of Japanese special effects movies is that everything goes mentality, that any crazy idea can make it onto the screen as long as it's interesting and visually appealing. And the filmmakers don't feel bound by having to limit how many strange ideas the audience is asked to accept. I have an anecdote to that effect I'd like to share. Back in 1999, one of the annual festivals of Godzilla fandom, organized by J.D. Lees and G-Fan magazine, was held at the Burbank Hilton. And one of the special guests that year was screenwriter Wataru Mimura, who was there in part to promote Godzilla 2000, which he'd written. And I had the privilege of helping moderate the audience Q&A with him, and I abused that position of power to sneak in a question of my own. I asked him, what was it about Japanese monster movies that felt they could do without all the rationalization and explanation that bogs down American monster movies? To be honest, I fully expected the answer to be something along the lines of deep-seated cultural differences between Japanese concepts of spirituality, something to do with Shintoism, some Japanese folklore, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's what I was aiming at. But Nomura just chuckled, and he put me in my place fast. He said, of course these movies have monsters in them. They're monster movies. He's absolutely right. You don't have to explain to the audience why people suddenly break into song in musicals. That's what the genre does. Why are there monsters in monster movies? Because otherwise they wouldn't be monster movies, dummy. Mothra is beautiful, colorful and elegant, simultaneously delicate and powerful. A distinctively Japanese monster. In fact, the American toy company Trendmasters discontinued their Mothra figure from their line of Godzilla action figures in the mid-1990s because their market research revealed American children had difficulty recognizing Mothra as a monster. Part of that disconnect is likely due to cultural differences. Our experience of moths is mostly as drab pests that eat cardigans. Tell me that a monster god had incarnated as a butterfly, though, and I'm with you. But in Japan, there are gloriously colorful and delicate moths that are more what we think of when we think of butterflies, but they have a heft and a power along with their beauty. Toho initially struggled with visualizing how Mothra should look. There was a brief period in the early pre-production process when, despite the name, art designers were toying with having her appear bird-like or even more humanoid like an angel. Then the designers took a hard left and started developing designs that were scarier and more insectoid. Some of that early thinking influenced how Columbia promoted the American release. They used a scarier, more insectoid design for Mothra in promotional art and posters, and relied on the novelization rather than the screenplay when developing the promotional copy. For example, Columbia kept the discarded name of Ailinus for the miniature priestesses. But Tsuburaya's final design for the monster is, to my mind, the perfect balance of otherworldly beauty, grace, and weirdness. Now's a good time to pick up that last thread of my argument that the Mothra model represented a clean break from the Godzilla model in terms of monster movie storytelling. The last factor to discuss is theme. Instead of a theme of man versus monster, this new approach is built around a theme of man versus man, and then adds monsters into that structure as a way of resolving the human conflicts. The central dramatic conflict in Mothra is that the capitalist values of the civilized world not only cruelly exploited the people of Infant Island, but virtually prohibited anyone from righting the obvious wrongs. Mothra's high priestesses had nowhere to turn to free them from slavery, but the most powerful government in the world quickly came to Clark Nelson's defense when anyone tried to interfere with his profit-making. And that's where the monster comes in. Mothra's existence is a way of making Clark Nelson's villainy everyone's problem. Everyone's lives and livelihoods are threatened by Mothra, so everyone has a stake in stopping Nelson. Saving Japan then isn't about defeating the monster, it's about resolving that human conflict and saving the girls. Consider this. James Cameron's 1986 thriller Aliens covers much of the same territory about a villainous industrialist who tries to bring back a science-fictional what's-it because he thinks it'll make him rich no matter how many lives he risks in the process, but Aliens is a grim and self-consciously arty action film. Mothra never takes itself too seriously, and therefore it's more surprising for its subtextual depth. Mothra is a family picture with entertainment as its primary goal. Given how incredibly iconic and influential and just right the ending of Mothra is, it's interesting and a little ironic how much hand-wringing and frustration went into figuring it out. There are a couple of alternate endings that were mooted, which I'm going to tell you about, and they're going to seem so very alien and wrong compared to the elegant perfection of what ultimately made it to the screen. In the novelization, Nelson is assassinated by a Rolisican citizen who's learned that Nelson's misuse of the Shobijin is causing Mothra's attacks. The little beauties are freed, and they crawl into Mothra's eye, and then they all fly off to Antarctica, which floats into the sky, so they can travel to something called a negative Earth. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, maybe a parallel world or something. In any event, Sekizawa had no interest in any of that. The deal with Columbia included a contractual requirement that Mothra attack a non-Japanese city. But as work on the film progressed, it became increasingly obvious this whole project was a budget-busting endeavor, so Sekizawa and Honda cooked up an alternate ending that was intended to be cheaper. Nelson was to kidnap Chujo's younger brother and the Shobijin and flee Japan in his private Cessna airplane. Mothra hatches from her cocoon and takes off after the plane in pursuit. Mothra forces the plane down in the Japanese Alps and then flaps her wings so hard that Nelson is blown off the ledge into a volcano. Toho wrote to the Columbia team asking their permission to use this rewritten ending instead of the version of the script that had already been approved. Problematically, Ishiro Honda had already set off for Mount Kirishima, an active volcano, to film the sequence as the start of principal photography, so there are publicity photos of Nelson on the mountainside, supposedly from Mothra's point of view. Aside from the publicity photos, however, nothing is known to survive from this shoot because Columbia blew their stack when they heard about it. We wanted a monster attacking a western city, and we're getting a monster attacking a western city right now! So, according to Honda at least, Toho just discarded the negatives from that first batch of shooting without even bothering to develop the film, and they reverted back to the scripted finale of Mothra descending on Newkirk City. In an earlier draft, Sekizawa had Mothra attacking New York City, but to keep the city fictional, his first instinct was to call it New Wagon City. Nobody liked that, so he changed it to Newark City. And this lasted until a production aide helpfully pointed out that in fact there is a real place called Newark. It isn't made up at all, so he swapped in Newkirk as the final name.
If you don't return the fairies quickly, Newkirk City will be destroyed.
Mothra stands as a unique monster movie event. It's one of Toho's greatest achievements. The filmmakers took for granted that the audience would be sympathetic with the monster because her violent city-destroying antics were related to an actual grievance that she was attending to. In a standard Monster on the Loose plot, the heroes ultimately discover the monster's Achilles heel and destroy the menace in the final reel. In the audacious conclusion to Mothra, the humans stop fighting her altogether. They give the monster exactly what she wants and let her return home, waving goodbye and saying sayonara. They even invite Mothra's priestesses to return when they wish. Mothra may be a force to reckon with, but she is not a menace to be destroyed. Mothra is a monster with distinct intelligence and noble motivations. And the movie changed the face of Japanese monsters forever. Of course there would still be movies in the Godzilla model, but the Mothra model became the default. From here on out, Toho's special effects films would almost always involve dramatic conflicts that could be articulated in words between human or humanoid antagonists, and the monster mayhem would arise in the context of those human disputes. Instead of having to overcome some unfathomable monster from the beyond, the films are about defeating corrupt businessmen, alien invaders, secret fascist military outfits, and schoolyard bullies. The heroes of the films would increasingly be ordinary people, like a befuddled toy inventor, the backing band from a TV show, a bank robber, a struggling cartoonist, and lots of reporters. And most of all, Toho's films would slip loose from any passing semblance of the real world and let the freak flag fly. I'll tell you a personal anecdote here. Let me get real for a moment. This is me. I've spoken before and written about the moment when I became a Godzilla fan. That was in 1976, when my parents took me to a drive-in theater for a double feature of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Godzilla vs. Megalon. But there's another moment in my life with Japanese monsters that actually looms much larger. A moment when I changed from being a Godzilla fan to being someone who wanted to commit seriously to the academic study of these films, and that happened in 1994. I'd purchased a VHS tape of Godzilla vs. Gigan, which is a 1972 Toho film written by Shinichi Sekizawa. I've made reference to it indirectly several times during this commentary. It's the one where invading cockroach people from outer space decide to overthrow the human race by building a Godzilla-themed amusement park, and they hire a struggling cartoonist to help them design some monster characters for the place. Okay, so that's the setup. Then you're watching this thing, And that's the premise, and you get to a scene where a general in the Japanese army is called in on a red alert because there are some space monsters bearing down on the planet. And in that moment, your brain is going, wait a minute. I'm being asked to accept not only that monsters exist, but space monsters on other planets do too. And these space monsters can come to Earth by just flying. They're not in rocket ships or anything. They just get up and start flying through the vacuum of space. And apparently they can fly through space at something approaching light speed, since the impression given is that the aliens summon the monsters and they show up a few hours later. Okay, but I haven't even gotten to the moment that changed my life yet, because it seems the space monsters, flying to Earth at the speed of light through the vacuum of space, are trash-talking to each other about getting pumped up for their upcoming battle with Godzilla. And these monster roars have been picked up by radio dishes on Earth, and the recording has been rushed to this general so he can start preparing a defense. And he listens to the recording, and he says, with all grave seriousness, "I recognize one of the monsters. That's King Ghidorah, but I don't recognize the other one." That is brilliant. That is sublime. That is transcendent. That changed me. I saw that scene, I heard that line, and I knew I had to devote resources to understanding how something like that could come into being in the world. Now, I have to acknowledge that my fairly aggressive pro-absurdity stance may appear to be a minority viewpoint. If you go around asking most fans of kaiju aiga, you'll reliably hear the opinion that the trend towards silliness that Shinichi Sekizawa ushered in was a mistake, and it killed off the genre in the 1970s. And I have to be careful how I address this, because that's an opinion held by many people I greatly admire, including friends and family, and some serious film scholars whose ideas are thoughtfully informed. If this is just framed as a question of personal taste, there's no real problem. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. If the silliness isn't your cup of tea, then good on you, I wish you well. Then again, though, I do have to ask why. If you rankle at such wacky stuff, why are you spending your time watching Japanese monster movies? Wouldn't you be happier enjoying some Italian neo-realist films instead? But I get it. There's some mighty fine motion pictures made in the Godzilla mold. The 1954 Godzilla is a true masterpiece, and Rodan is also tremendous entertainment. The 1984 Return of Godzilla is one of my very favorites, and part of the reason the Legendary Pictures reboot of Godzilla movies in Hollywood succeeded where previous attempts failed was the canny use of the Godzilla storytelling model in 2014. If we want to argue over objective facts, though, instead of subjective aesthetics, I think I win hands down. Mothra and its immediate successor, King Kong vs. Godzilla, set box office records that remain dominant some 6 decades later and counting. The commercial imperative of that success was undeniable, and not only did Toho establish the Mothra model as the default mode for its giant monsters going forward, but this approach starts to spread across to the competitors. In just a few short years, Toho started facing competition from Dai in the form of Gamera, a fire-breathing giant turtle that is friend to all children. The Gamera movies are in every way exemplars of the Mothra model of storytelling. Then the competition moved to the small screen, as Eiji Tsuburaya's company Tsuburaya Productions started making the TV show Ultraman. This isn't the time or place to dig into the myriad variants and offshoots and knockoffs that precede and flow from Ultraman, but suffice it to say, the Japanese TV quickly filled up with heroic monsters and robots defending the Earth from bad guys in stories that have almost no recognizable link to the real world at all. And that's where some of the critics of the silliness go awry. There's a tendency to look at reduced ticket sales and lower grosses for the later, sillier films, and chalk it up to audiences rejecting them. But as I've already noted, in 1961, Mothra was the only thing remotely like it on Japanese screens the entire year. Let's flash forward this time. Let's talk about 1974. Toho released Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla that year, and it had to compete against a slew of incomers, including the reissued champion cut-down version of Mothra. Not only were there countless Ultraman-style TV superhero shows running for free on TV, but there were at least 4 theatrical releases derived from those franchises as well. All of this during a period of time for the Japanese film industry in which studios went bankrupt and theaters were shuttered. There's just no way to fairly compare what things were like for Japanese monster films in 1974 versus 1961 if all you do is look at box office returns. The bizarre, absurd, bonkers world of Japanese monsters that exploded in the wake of Mothra became a brand identity with an international following. Generations of people around the world fell in love with this stuff and held on to that love tenaciously. I did. And I won't brook anyone slagging off the glorious, soul-satisfying silliness of the craziest of these films. There is no other filmmaking context anywhere in the world where you'd get away with saying, yeah, let's make a movie about cockroaches running a theme park, and they put out a Craigslist ad for some monsters for hire, and then the monsters come to Earth and a general says, I don't recognize one of them. And that's because no other kind of filmmaker would have been comfortable with what happens here in Mothra, with miniature twins singing songs to a giant moth god. This is what threw open the floodgates to later absurdity. This is where that all starts. I bet no one had to talk you into watching this movie. I bet you sought this out hungrily, enthusiastically, and you're listening to my commentary because you already love this movie. Well, I do too. I love everything about it, and I love everything that it caused to be in its wake. Thank you so much for letting me share it with you today, and I hope that you share it with somebody that you love too. Thank you.
平和こそは永遠に続く繁栄への道である。